Hello, and welcome to this third podcast for the Social Work Theories and Models module at the University of Northampton, and welcome if you are coming from outside the university. Hope you're really going to enjoy this show and find the content useful for your practice and your development as a social worker. So let's start with the idea this is social work process we're talking about here, and what do we mean by process? If we start with a fairly simple, straightforward dictionary definition, we get the idea that a process is a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. So that's the kind of generic, general view of what a process is. But then when we apply that to, well, what's the social work process? The first thing that should alert us to is that question of achieve a particular end. Now, think about what are the particular ends for social work. And in answering that question, what you will discover is you will discover that that takes you directly back to what I was talking about last week about models of social work. Because whether you're talking about a managerial model or a maintenance model or a therapeutic model or a radical model of social work, that will mean that your view of the ends that you're working to through this process are different. But although the ends are different, I'm going to suggest that there is a generic, general process through which social work proceeds that is a useful way to think about what you're doing as a social worker. So the model I'm going to use is one that's been around for a while. It's been around since at least the 1980s, and it's based on the work of Sutton, and it's called the Aspire model. This is quite a widely used model across the helping professions, not just in social work, but in lots of other areas as well. And the acronym ASPIRE stands for Assess, Plan, Implement, Review and Evaluate. So according to Sutton, they are the four main stages of the helping process. Now I'm going to suggest that as good as that model is, there are two really important steps missing from it. Firstly, there's the step of engagement. You can't really assess somebody until you've at least got some minimal working relationship with them. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a deep relationship. It doesn't have to be one that takes ages to develop. You can develop that kind of rapport relatively quickly to the point where at least someone is willing to talk with you, listen to you, communicate with you enough to do the work that you need to do. Secondly, I think Sutton misses out the importance of closure, that you work with somebody and you need to bring that work to an end and help them carry on without you. As a social worker, you're only in people's lives for a relatively short period usually, and you need to move them on and through that. So it's important to talk about closure. We could also look briefly at whether we're talking about stages, phases, or processes generally. So this is often seen as a staged model. I'm not so sure about that myself. So what do I mean by this? Well, if we talk about stages, stages have clearly defined beginning and end points. You enter this stage, you leave this stage, it's all nice and neat and nice and clear. With phases, it's a little bit more blurry and there's a smooth transition between the different parts of the process with no clear boundary. Or we can think about it as being a series of processes about what you need to do, and that the balance of what you need to do will vary as you go through the social work process as a whole. And that's really what I'm going to suggest to you is a really helpful way to think about this particular model. So if we look at a stage model, if we put the Carroll Sutton model, you start with engagement, then you assess, then you plan, then you implement, then you review and evaluate, then you close. And it's got these distinct separate phases, stages. If you look at it more of a phased model, you get those same processes, but as you can see, they're a little bit more blended into each other. Each one moves from one to the other. And actually, but I'm going to suggest that neither of those really represents or really visualizes very effectively what happens in actual social work practice. They give a kind of overall model. They don't reflect practice. And I think there's a different way of thinking about it, which is much more accurate reflection of what happens in social work practice. So we look at a processes model, and I represent this. On the one side, you've got processes. So what do you do? And then on the second axis there, you've got time from first contact to last contact. What do you do at each stage? And what I'm going to suggest is those 6 things of engage, assess, plan, implement, review, evaluate, and close, that you're actually doing those continuously through the process. So at the start, when you make first contact, as you can see, you're doing quite a lot of engagement, you're doing quite a lot of assessment, there's a certain amount of planning, and then the implement and evaluate review are relatively small. And you'll notice there, that may seem a little bit odd, but you've got quite a bit of closure there, because I do think from first contact, you need to be thinking about how to help people carry on without you, how to close, to finish the relationship. You need to begin with the end in mind, as Stephen Covey wrote in the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of his principles is begin with the end in mind. And as a social worker, you need to have that end point in mind right from the beginning, and you need to be clearly communicating that to service users. And then as you move on, as you can see, the assessment goes up, and then the planning starts to come in. So your early work, you're assessing so you can develop your plan. And then in the mid-range of the work, you're doing a lot more implementation there, but you're beginning to increase your review and evaluation. You're beginning to increase your closure as you go through that work. You're still engaging, you're still assessing as that goes along. And then at the end of the work, you move into closure, and you'll notice there that the planning actually goes up again, because you're planning to help people cope without you. So as you can see, each of the 6 processes is going on, but they're happening slightly differently. So we can visualize that across the whole process. So this factors in the whole thing from first contact to closure. As you can see, the amount you're doing, I mean, and I even think this is a bit of a simplification of what happens in practice, but that gives you an idea. You can see that you're doing all 6 processes, but the amount you're doing at each stage of the overall process will vary. So we can see that as time goes on, that's representing your time through your work. You can see as you go through that, what you do at each stage, the amount you do of each of the 6 processes will vary. I want you to think about overall, where do theories fit into this? So particularly, I want you to think about, you can put this in the discussions on the YouTube video, or you can put it in the discussions on the discussion board if you're on the module. I want you to think about where theories fit, what theories you can use for engaging with people, what are the key theories you need there, for assessing people's needs and circumstances, what theories do you need there, when it comes to planning an intervention or carrying that intervention out, what theories do you need to use? When it comes to review and evaluating your intervention, what theories do you need to use? And when you close the work successfully, how is theory going to help you do that? So I'll give you some final thoughts here as we come towards the end. Notice that I've talked about social work theories, but you can use this same model to think about what skills you need to develop. Why does this matter? You know, it's important that you actually have some process in mind. You need to know what you're doing. If you just carelessly blunder around in people's lives, you're going to make a right mess of things. But if you have a model, if you have a framework that guides your practice, and I talked about this in the What is Theory in the first video, I talked about guiding your practice. So if you've got that model to guide your practice, it'll help you know what's the best thing to do, where you go next. Now, I've also been a little bit cheeky with today's video, because some of the more observant of you, in fact, hopefully most of you will have noticed that at various points during this video, little letters have popped up. And if you make a note of what those letters are and write them down and rearrange them, they will form a word. And what I'm going to say is that for the first 3 students, there's going to be a bit of a competition here. And for the first 3 students to email me with an email from your university email account with the subject line of those letters rearranged into the word that you think I'm thinking of, there'll be a little prize for the first 3 students to send that to me in an email. So it's a bit of fun, nothing too serious. Thank you for listening and all the best.